Hi everyone, and welcome back for another episode of Cozy Up for English. In a previous video, we looked at different ways you could express what you had done over the weekend using the simple past verb tense. In today's video, what I would like to do is look at the 3 different ways of pronouncing regular verbs conjugated in the simple past tense. What this will do for you is help you with your pronunciation when speaking in the simple past tense in an English-speaking environment. But now before we do anything else, don't forget to cozy up so we can get started. Now here we go. As I mentioned earlier in this video, there are 3 separate ways of pronouncing the ed ending of verbs conjugated by the general rule of the simple past tense. Those 3 ways go as follows. Example number 1, we can pronounce the ed ending as a T, which would give, for example, the verb to cook, conjugated in the simple past, becoming I cooked, pronounced like a T. The second way is like a D, in which case we make a D sound at the end of our verb. For example, the verb to remember, pronounced remembered in the simple past tense. And finally, the third way we can pronounce that ed is by really pronouncing it, by making the ed sound at the end of your verb. For example, with a verb like to demand, which we would pronounce I demanded in the simple past tense. So as you can see, these 3 different ways are very different when it comes to pronunciation, but you must always remember that they are always written the same way, which means they are always written with the ed ending on paper. It's really just about pronunciation today. Now let's take a minute to look at some tips and tricks that you can use when you want to decide which pronunciation you're supposed to use when speaking in the simple past tense. Let's go back to the first example I gave with the verb to cook. Now what's important here is to look at the last sound that I'm pronouncing when I say the infinitive verb to cook. As you can see, the last sound I'm making is the K sound, the K sound. This in English is what is referred to as a voiceless sound, which means that my vocal cords do not vibrate when I make that sound. And when that is the case, this is when we're going to use the T ending for our ed pronunciation. And that is why the verb to cook becomes I cooked, you cooked, he, she, it cooked. And the same for all of the rest of the pronouns. Now for the second pronunciation, the D pronunciation, you will again want to look at the last sound you make when pronouncing the infinitive verb. For example, to remember, the example I gave at the beginning of this video, if we pronounce the verb to remember, the last sound I'm making at the end of my verb is the sound, like that. Now, contrary to the K sound, this is what we call a voiced sound. In that sense, what we mean is that our vocal cords do vibrate, because when we make the sound, it's a harder sound. And in that sense, our vocal cords are activated to make that sound. When that happens, this is when you will want to pronounce your ed like a D sound. And that's why the verb to remember becomes I remembered, you remembered, he, she, it remembered. And again, the same for the rest of the pronouns. Now for the third pronunciation, which is my personal favorite because it is the simplest one to identify. You're going to again want to look at the end of your verb. And all you have to recognize here is, does the infinitive verb end with a T or a D sound? Such as the verb to demand, which already ends with a D sound. And in that case, this is the only time where you're going to want to really pronounce that ed at the end of your verb, which is why the verb to demand in the simple past becomes I demanded, you demanded, he, she, it demanded. So as you can see, this is the only time we really emphasize on the ed sound at the end of our verbs. Now let's jump in with some examples. If I were to use the verb to walk in the simple past, I could say a sentence such as, he walked for an hour to get to the store. And in that sense, I am conjugating the verb to walk in the simple past by adding the ed in writing. But because we're once again looking at a verb that ends with the k sound, which is a voiceless sound, we're going to pronounce that ed like a T. And that's why the sentence is pronounced, he walked 1 hour to get to the store. And now for another example where we would pronounce the ed ending in the D sound, we could say something like, she played at the beach all morning. And finally, for another example where we would pronounce the full ed ending, the ed sound at the end of our verb, we could say something like, they invented a new app. And by really pronouncing that ed, you're properly pronouncing and properly conjugating your verbs in the simple past tense. The most important thing for you to remember is that all of these rules only apply to pronunciation. When you write in English and you're conjugating verbs by the general rule of the simple past tense, always remember to add that ed ending and you'll be just fine. What we saw today are 3 ways to help you pronounce like a native speaker of English. So that was it for today, and if you liked today's video, feel free to click that like button below and subscribe to my channel. And as always, feel free to leave comments or questions in the comment section below about this video or any other English-related question that you may have. And so until next class, have a wonderful week.